All right. Hello, everybody here and at home joining us virtually. Today, I'll jump right into it. We have two great presentations that are lined up. The first is from Berhan Taye. Berhan is an independent researcher, analyst, and facilitator who investigates the relationship between technology, society, and social justice. She is currently a practitioner fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab, Stanford University, and has affiliations with the Center for Intellectual Property and IT at Strathmore University. Berhan also serves as a senior advisor to Internew's Global Internet Freedom Project. We also have Trudee Coetzee, who's a PhD student at the University of Pretoria, and her research focuses on whether generative artificial intelligence tools have a place in higher education institutions in South Africa. She is also a senior academic reviewer at the Global Education Movement Project in Rwanda, where she oversees a team of educators, and the project focuses on helping refugees obtain higher education degrees. And I'll leave it up to them to do the presentation.
Good morning. You can hear me okay? Yeah, awesome. Okay, so you can see the slides. I'm very excited to bring you this project that I've been working on for the past 2 years. It's what I call the pipeline of harm. So for the past few years, I've been collaborating with my colleague Joanne Cunha and trying to understand what we call the artificial intelligence or AI pipeline of harm, and this is the first series. And we'll get to hear from Joanne a bit later. So the conversation today we'll go through what we call the research story, lit review, research questions, meta research findings, and then maybe we'll end the conversation around, what comes after this. So a bit of a story of this research. So a few years ago, I was working at the Algorithm Justice League, AJL, and they have an AI harms analyst. So AJL has an AI harms report function where users across the US and globally would report incidents of how they've been affected by automated systems. So this can be FRTs from at airports or shot spotters in black and brown neighborhoods across the US. We would get hundreds of reports of how just the general public and particularly minorities across the US have been harmed by automated systems. So my work was to categorize these harms, research remedies, contact individuals who can potentially support these individuals that have been harmed. It was not an easy work, and often there was literally nobody to help. And sometimes it's also really hard to verify if someone has been harmed by these tools and sort of have the evidence. So I was curious to sort of understand how this would work in our context, in my context, being African women. So this presentation today is a series of research engagements I've been conducting in the past few years to sort of understand this. And as I was doing this, what I realized was that it was actually quite impossible to have this conversation without really thinking about the people that put in the data, the people that are working on the data, the people that are cleaning the data. And if you're having this conversation in any global majority context, and for me, the global majority is everyone except Western Europe and North America, we shouldn't be having conversations about how artificial systems are harming us without having a conversation around how data is used, how who cleans it, who makes it ready for machine use. So I've divided these harms into three. So the first I'm looking at and the conversation we'll be having today will be harms to those that build the system. So this is focused on data workers. The second is harm to those that are managed by the system. So this research is focused on app drivers, and particularly looking at Bolt and Uber drivers based out of Nairobi. The first one is also based out of Nairobi. The last one that I'm looking at is automated by the system. So this is what I call the kill list, content moderation on Facebook, and particularly in a violent situation like Ethiopia. So this is sort of the big picture that I'm trying to paint in my context. And so the first conversation today will be around the first section, which is harm to those that build the system, focused on data workers. So I'm not the first one that has done this. There are numerous researchers that have been looking at this. So Gary and Suri wrote one of the first books on this issue called Ghost Worker. Kate Crawford and her wonderful book on Atlas of AI really maps this. Mila and her work on the same issue in Latin America. Mark Graham and his work at the Oxford Internet Institute. And Philip Jones, and honestly this book is one of the best books I've read on this topic, called Work Without Workers, Labor in the Age of Platform Capitalism, are some of the authors that have really informed this work. But of course, some of these publications are a bit limited for me, and that's sort of a gap that I'm seeing. It's, out of a lot of the folks that are doing this work, it's only the Distributed AI Research Institute that has come out actually this week, really detailing the plight of workers, but making sure that the workers are part of this conversation, not necessarily, sort of on the receiving end. So that's sort of some of the gap that I'm also trying to address, so that, how can we have an output that is, one, very policy focused, but also particularly trying to understand, what would be useful for the workers so that they can organize and sort of, have a breakthrough in this space. And I'm a practitioner researcher, so that's sort of where my background is. Yeah. Okay, so with this research, I wanted to understand basically three things. What does data work entail? A lot of us that actually are using these automated systems actually don't know how the data is cleaned, how, what is that work? And with this conversation today, I'm hoping you can get a bit of an idea of what that looks like. How do you clean machines? What are the condition, norms, and challenge and opportunities that workers have? This has been covered by other workers, by other researchers also previously. Are there any, worker-led efforts that improve and resist this working conditions and norms? And we've heard from Daniel last week. There are some really marvelous ones, so our attempt is also to sort of map who are the others that are doing this. And how can we present these stories in an accessible manner so that the workers can interact, engage with this research, right? Nobody's paying $200 to read an academic journal, because we don't have the money most of the time, not that the work is not good. Okay, so moving on quickly, sort of our research methodology was that, we had semi-structured interviews, focus groups. As we were doing this, and again, as my work is really focused with practitioners and trying to understand how can we support workers, we had to, what I call a research detour. So we had to introduce a validation workshop because the group that we were working with was very interested in unionizing and sort of figuring out how can we take this to the labor board and other spaces in a Kenyan context. So we were cautious enough to bring in others in the room and sort of see, okay, these are the things that have come out of the research. Does this make sense to you, sort of get that validation? And then my role also shifted as an observer now when we're engaging with the labor board and other unions, because I'm not a worker, I don't represent anyone. So my role was to really just take notes in those conversations for the workers. So there was a bit of a detour there. Great, so what is data work? So data in this context, so what you see on your, I guess, right, is percentage of time allocated to machine learning projects. So this is data that comes from this global AI project management group called Congletica. So basically, without data, machine learning and automated decision-making systems are empty vessels. So you can create whatever tool you want without really the, sort of the curated data that you need. It would not render anything. But then the most important thing is also to render the desired results. These systems have to be trained on our data that's context-specific, cleaned, labeled, classified, segmented, and annotated. And those are really critical things that we're going to be talking about today. Fortunately or unfortunately, humans are the only ones that can do this really laborious task, and it's not glamorous, it's not nice, it's really exploitative, which we'll see a bit. And then 65% of the work, and I'm being very conservative in here, I think there are numerous data that shows there actually is more than 80% of sort of setting up this system is actually, 65% of your time will be cleaning the data, labeling, and augmenting it. So you need a massive workforce to be able to do that. And this engagement is not just one-off. Once you've cleaned up the data, set it up, it doesn't mean that you're not going to engage with it again. But also, this is not a poor industry. It's an industry that's, quite thriving. So global data industry is estimated to reach 2.5 billion. Again, this is a very conservative estimation, and by within a decade, we're expecting it to be at 13 billion. So somebody's making a lot of money. It's not us. or the workers that are labeling the data. So who are the individuals or companies that are supplying human labor for AI? So Scale AI, I don't know, how many of you know Scale AI? How many of, oh, wonderful, excellent, okay. And Remote Task, how many of you know Remote Task? Yay, okay. Appen, okay, fun, wonderful. Has anyone worked on Remote Task? I have, a bit, I've tried it. Okay, so Appen is another industry player, Toloka, Hive, but the biggest players in the space are Scale and Appen. And these companies are also very close to the military-industrial complex, so they're not just cleaning and labeling data, they're also forcing governments, they're telling us China's coming, build your system before they do, is the sort of the narrative that a lot of them are spewing out there. So this research focuses mostly on Scale AI and Remote Task, that's the subsidiary, or the parent company is called Scale AI, but they're really trying to deassociate themselves because they don't want to talk about the fact that a significant majority of their revenue comes actually from them supplying human labor. So what we also have seen with this research is that there's no, like most data workers actually, and our colleague yesterday was also talking about this, they don't just work for one company, they work for numerous at the same time. So 90% of, we spoke with 60, we did 60 interviews, focus group with about 40 individuals, and all of them either work for 2 or 3. So it's not just one, and this is focused on Kenya as well. Okay, I want to give you an idea of a bit of just to give you an idea of like who these individuals are that are running these companies. So, and I'm gonna pick on Alexander Wong. So how many of you know this individual? Okay, you should really know him. He's a dangerous human being. No, honestly, he is. So he's the founder of Scale AI, and here he's labeled as the world's youngest self-made billionaire. It's the part that really stresses me out is self-made. He's really not self-made. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals that are actually creating this revenue for him, and he's shaking up tech. And then there's another one here that says, exclusive interview, how a 24-year-old Alexander Wang grew Scale AI into a 3.5 billion powerhouse. And there's no mention of the humans that are actually doing this work. So the media really plays into this really problematic narrative that we have. Anyways, okay, so moving on. So one of the things that I wanted to do with this conversation, and sort of also observing what we did the past few days, is sort of give you an idea of what does this work actually look like. What do we mean when we say humans are actually labeling this data? These are a fair classification of the different work that people have to do. So landmark annotation, data annotation, speech recognition is very common, transcription, so categorization, content moderation is one. Polygon annotation, and I'll give you some examples on this. LiDAR tasks, which are the most complicated, and segmentation are some of the work that people do. And these are like, the individuals that we spoke with, when we asked them what are the things that you do, these are some of the common things that they do, and all of these tasks are very different, complex, some are easy, some are not. Okay, everybody loves cats, so what is the work? What does it entail? So one of the things that you could be doing would be you'd be classifying, saying individual, like, is this a cat or a dog? It can be as simple as that. Or it can be, you'd line up different kinds of black people, and then you'll tell me the shade of blackness. Or there are some that I've seen, for instance, labeling people as indigenous or not. So it's just and this is a very simple example, but it can become a bit more complex and a bit more racist. And you're wondering, why do you need to label people indigenous or not, right? And who decides who's indigenous? So this is one of the things. The most common one is classification that we see. And then the second one would be object detection. So workers would be asked to, in this context, for instance, there's a picture, there's a frame here, so they would have to put boxes around each object. So again, this is quite simple in a way, but it can become a bit more complicated. There's also what we call semantic segmentation. So here you can see the car, the house, and the sky are all labeled differently. So you can have different kinds of fruits, and those will be labeled very differently. So again, it gets as, becomes complex, it can be very simple. And this is very typical in medical field, e-commerce, retail. I've seen a lot of frames of, like, for instance, a breast cancer tumor, and you train the individuals to be able to sort of tell, or a vein. So honestly, you can segment anything, including this room, right? And you also have to ask yourself, what is this being used for? Some could be useful, some maybe not. The next one is what we call polygon annotation. So this becomes very complex. This one, okay, I'm going to quickly go back. This was just adding boxes, which is a bit more simpler. This you can, you label them different colors, and you're given those instructions. And then this one would be just adding polygon annotations on each one. I don't know who needs QE annotated, but that's a thing. That's very common. But also it becomes very complex. So you'd have, like, the accuracy is based on the number of dots you put. And you could be doing this for like 7, 8, 9 hours on different things. So it's just, so when you take a picture of something and your phone recognizes it, it means that this was done by somebody, probably sitting out of Kenya or India or other places, yeah. So last but not least, this is what we call LiDAR annotations. So these are 3D annotations, normally used, you attach a camera to either planes, drones, or a moving car. So this is sort of what they do. So this is attached to the one on the left would be a car. So this can be, so this is the most paying. If in most contexts, the LiDAR annotations are the ones that would be paying the most. But a camera could be attached to a 6-lane highway that could be just driving on a very busy street for like 6 hours. So you'd have to put, you see on the right, on your left, what is right and left? Okay, on your left rather, you see the small boxes that have been annotated there with the cars. So this, you'd be doing this for an extensive amount of time. So it's quite time consuming. And the conversation around, for instance, that we were having this week around the lady that was hit by a car as she was walking her bike. And again, this is, I'm just contemplating here, so this might not be a fact, but maybe the data didn't have a human walking their bike. What they might have had was that a human riding their bike. So everything has, you have to categorize and label everything, and there's so much burden also, and responsibility, unfair responsibility, and uncompensated responsibility on the workers. So these are some of the things that folks have. One thing that was interesting when Philip Jones was talking about sort of LiDAR annotation particularly, and drone image. A lot of, some of the workers that actually do this work in Syria and Yemen and refugee camps. And this drone image, as far as we can tell, especially for Scale AI, some of the clients are US Army, right? So these drones that you train, and could be the ones that are coming up to sort of bomb your village as well. So there's that sort of really nasty and vicious cycle where you're killed by the work that you've done. Okay, so who are the clients? Who are the people that need this kind of work done? And so I took examples from Scale AI's website. So how many of you know this app called Yuka? Okay, if we were in Europe, a lot of folks would. Okay, so what Yuka does is basically, you take a picture of the ingredients you have on the list, you upload it, they'll promise you, they'll send you whether your food is toxic, has sulfate, all of the good stuff that you don't need on your food. They'll send you a list, like if your food is good or not, within 2 hours of you uploading it. So if the content or the brand that you've uploaded is not within their database, Scale AI will send that to workers in Kenya. They would be asked to label this, and then it's sent back. And sort of the quick turnaround is quite a stressful thing for workers. So this is one of the company based out of Europe particularly. The second one is Petra. So this is another company that based out of New York, that does e-commerce toolkits, ideation tools. So all of the things that these influencers use, so this is one of the things that Petra does. So what workers are asked to do is, for instance, if I am modeling this cloth that I have, and you take a picture of me and I'm trying to put it on Instagram, this might not be a pretty background, right? So they have this system that would automatically add a background so that it's much more nicer for our consumer culture. then what workers are asked to do is now to make sure that there's no, there's no dead body attached to, to the picture. So it's really benign things like that. And also say, gauge if that's, if you compare the first picture and the second one, and workers are asked which one is better. So this is the second thing. So influencer culture also is really increasing this issue. The other one is Harvard Medical School. They get their data annotated, medical or other research data annotated by Scale AI. The next one, of course, is Toyota Research Institute. There's a video of Toyota on Scale AI's website that is extremely problematic, that they talk about how it was really wonderful to find Scale AI and magically the data was annotated without any mentioning of the workers that have to do this. So US Department of Defense is a big customer of Scale AI, and I've seen actually they're opening a lot of boot camps in the US. I know there's a few coming up in St. Louis. They're hiring for a lot of people. The assumption is that they don't want to train, other foreigners to train sensitive data. I don't know how much workers in the US are paid, but that's a trend that we're seeing. So the other usual ones, some of you might know Cohere. OpenAI is a customer, surprise. Skydo is another one. So they have really diverse customers, and I just want you to get an idea of who are these guys that need this kind of data annotated. Okay, great. So who are the workers? So there's a very interesting worker classification that happens within Scale AI and Remo Task. So the first ones are taskers. So they're paid per task. So it doesn't mean that just because you annotated that Kiwi that you saw in the picture doesn't mean that you're going to get paid. You're paid per accurately annotated task. So the accuracy is the biggest problem. So when I logged into Scale AI and pretended to be a service seeker, and then I managed to see their video, so what they tell you is that, what they tell their customers is that, you can be annotating like 50 images. Out of those 50 images, there will be 2 or 3 evaluation tasks that are hidden within the system. So even if you annotated 47 of those tasks accurately and you missed the 3, your task will be labeled as inaccurate and you'll be kicked out of the system. So, and the taskers that we spoke with actually didn't know that. So that's one of the biggest problems, is the fact that there's no, and this is a key performance indicator for them, but there's no clarity around that. And there are many, of course, exploitation that happens in different forms, but one of the issues that they had was this. The other is the lack of contract. There's no contract. You just sign up to the taskers are really the backbone of the platform. They have no formal relationship with the company, so which becomes extremely problematic. So the next ones are reviewers, again, paid per task and review. So reviewers are paid per the tasks they correct. Even if I've done everything correctly as a tasker, when my task goes to a reviewer, the reviewer is paid based on the tweaks that they make on the tasks that I've done. So which incentivizes them to correct even the corrections that are correct, even the tasks that are correct. As they do more corrections, my accuracy level goes down. If my accuracy level is below 80%, I get kicked off the project. So there's such a really high tension between reviewers and taskers. Same thing with super reviewers. Again, paid per task, reviews, and then they're supposed to correct. So you're really creating this really vicious cycle of undercompensating the taskers that are actually doing this work. The last one are trainers. So these are wage workers. They're paid every 2 weeks and they have a contract. But their contract is not a contract, it's an NDA. No protections, no, and there are many issues that we can go through, but one of the things that I really want to highlight here is that trainers are required to recruit 50 people that work on the platform every 2 weeks. If you get 49, it doesn't work. If you get 48, it doesn't work. It has to be 50. It's really difficult to get 50 people to a room every 2 weeks. So you find people recruiting at train stations, matatu stage, literally everywhere. Like in Nairobi, there was a time where you'd get random WhatsApp from people saying, if you want a job, there's a job, you should come to this boot camp. I used to get a couple of that. Extremely problematic, and they would have to actually advertise out of pocket, because you can get, you can ask all your cousins, all your family for the next 3 weeks, but then you run out of people at the end. So it's such a stressful point. Then they don't get paid if they don't meet that quota. So they're creating such a very different sort of worker dynamics here. Anyways, okay, what were our research findings? So what was very interesting was there's a researcher called Ben Rogley who talks about micro struggles of workers on platforms and how it's really important to document micro struggles. And then I further add on to that saying, there are also micro resistances that happen, so I think it's important to document both. But it wouldn't be fair to talk about this conversation without having a conversation about the contracts. I think contracts are really critical. Most workers don't have that. There's no formal relationship, so there's no way for the government or for unions, for others to step in. And the Kenyan laws are also very problematic in a sense that they don't provide any protections. So one of the angles that we're approaching is trying to see how can we get platform workers to be, at least provide them some kind of protection. So contracts are the biggest problem. The only ones that have contracts are the trainers, and their contract. I've seen it, we've read it. It's an NDA, it's not a contract, and you get your contract updated every month. And there's no notice period, no sick leave. You can work 14 hours, no proper compensation for overtime. Okay. The other one is the people that we spoke with, majority of them were below the age of 30. They've worked on the platform for 5, 6, 7 years without any career growth or trajectory. Someone can work on the platform for 5 years as a tasker, never progress to being a reviewer or a trainer, which is really problematic. So if you work in an offline context in a construction site, for instance, and I don't know much about South Africa, but for the rest of us in the continent, you can learn on the job. Within a few years, you can be a foreman with very limited, formal training. There's none of this happening in this space, and there's so much work that taskers have to do in order to self-train, but that doesn't go anywhere, which is quite depressing, especially for a young continent. The other one is, of course, the biggest issue is fair compensation. When Jeff Bezos came up with the human as a service concept, and we've seen this with platforms such as Amazon's Mechanical Turk, we're in a state where before you sign up for the job, actually you don't know how much you're being paid. So you might have worked for 6 hours, literally just putting boxes on each QE that you find. You might be paid $5, which is great. You might also be paid $1, or you might not be paid because your accuracy is not correct and your reviewer has made so many changes to it. So it's really precarious. You might also actually make $500 if you've worked so many hours, have different accounts, and then it might take 3 months for you to get your money. Or what Remotask has done right now is that they've shut down the platform with a lot of force, including my colleague who are owned a lot of money by the platform. So it's not glamorous. So we should be asking, what are these tools that we're using? Okay, so what are the resistances? And this is, I guess, my favorite part. We've had conversations with Daniel, who was talking about, setting up a union, sort of his fight with Samasource. But there are many that have, and we're talking about the resistance because Remotask has shut down, and we can now publicly talk about how do people resist within these platforms. So it would not have been, ethical to talk about how you can circumvent the platform with the platform. So I just want to put that as a disclaimer. Okay, so people have multiple accounts. I do this work, you don't pay me with this account, I'll try with the other one. We've met people that have had 15, 16 accounts on different platforms, all at the same time, and they will work all of them. And the way you get access to tasks is really bizarre. There's no way to predict. So you just create as many accounts, you work as many as you can, you get as much as you can. So this is how people have been resisting. The other one is you set up paid VPN so that you can access better rates. So if you set up your VPN in the UK, the US, other places, the system is very different. You can see how much you're being paid. So people are smart. They're not just waiting for Alexander Wang to grow a heart. No, that's not happening. The other one is people lease, rent, and sell accounts. So I'll work really hard on an account to really build my track, and then I'll lease it for you so that you can make a few money, and then you'll share that profit with me. So this is some of the things that you can rent it, you can also sell it. And selling accounts is such a significant thing. But of course, this also doesn't mean that it doesn't come with repercussions. In Kenya, in 2021, all Kenyan workers were suspended for 2 weeks because of multiple accounts. but you find a better VPN that doesn't let you. And then when they find it, you find another one. So which has been really interesting to see how people have been fighting. The other one is you buy US registered accounts or UK registered accounts, which is great because then you know, it's much more easier to sort of set up that system. You get better paying jobs. You make sure, though, your VPN doesn't let you down. If your IP address logs in Kenya, that account is gone. So these are some of the ways that people are, you know, collaborating with people across the Atlantic and other places. Okay, so browser extensions are really critical. You have to continuously refresh your account to sort of see how you can get assigned a job. So there are multiple browser extensions that people use to sort of refresh their page. They also set up Slack, WhatsApp, Telegram, Discord channels and groups to share information and create transparency, which is really critical. And these are also spaces where people are organizing. Multiple peoples will be on Google Meet calls throughout the night so that they can support each other. So if one falls asleep, they're like nudging them, like, you know, if we do this, if we finish this by the morning, you know, we can start the next leg of work. So, yeah. So very quickly, I know I'm running out of time. One needs to change. And in the way that I understand change here is there are things that need to change right now, right, so that people can get better pay, people can get better, you know, better income, but also change also has to be a bit different. We can't, you know, our decision can't be, you know, give people contracts while you're still exploiting them, right? Like, so we have to sort of think about that. So I'm a bit struggling with sort of this, but we think the first really critical thing is that the government and the labor board has to really close the legal loopholes that these companies are you know, using. So providing protections to platform workers is really critical. The next one is, you know, providing pathways to protection. So we're seeing unionization as an option, association formation, and then skill development. The other really critical one that I want to have a conversation with all of you is that an ethical, responsible, and decolonial AI is free from worker exploitation. And we really have to stress that and have to go back and ask ourselves, you know, a lot of us are thinking about, you know, how's this clothes made? Like, there are so many sectors that have done this, right? Like, so this can't be one that we miss out in having conversation. So for me, what is also the alternative here? And what, you know, others call, you know, post-activism, for instance. So with Edward, we've been talking about resistance and sabotage. So, you know, how can we use data workers as allies for computational sabotage, right? When you're being asked to label if someone is indigenous or not, what could you, you know, what could we do to make, you know, with the right political education, you know, the army of data workers could rescue us from the tyranny of the machines in many ways. So they are, you know, the first line of defense in telling us what is coming before it comes. So, yeah, that's, you know, whether as saboteurs or whistleblowers, this can be something that we can explore. And then cooperatives and worker-owned data shops are really critical, right? Like, if we shift this into a more ethical and decolonial AI space. It's not to say that this work is not important. There's some really critical work that can be done, but how can we shift this to a more, you know, to a more post-capitalist and worker-owned and cooperative-owned system? Yeah, I want to play a video for 1 minute. This is my collaborator, Joanne. Let's see if we can play. A disclaimer is that all the things that she says about me on the video, I told her to take it out. She said, no, you can't. So it's not an advertisement on me. I just want to put that out there. Yeah, she said no. Okay. Oh, hold on, Joanne.
And for over 5 years, I have worked as a micro worker in the digital landscape. Throughout this journey, I've seen the highs and lows of corporate and freelance work alike. I had the privilege to collaborate with Berhan on this groundbreaking research, and it was eye-opening. Together, we had to come up with questions that were to form base of the research, and we had to interview individuals. I managed to gather around 50 to 60 individuals, capturing their first-hand experiences with digital platforms. What we found out was eye-opening and a bit overwhelming. And what stood out is that we were being violated. Rather, our rights were being violated and we were being exploited. From these challenges, we decided to embark on a journey to unionize. We realized the world needed to recognize our contribution in the AI industry. So after thorough consultation, despite the hurdles, we are forging ahead. We are forging ahead to establish structures to safeguard our rights and amplify our voices. Berhan's dedication was instrumental, should I say was or is still instrumental. Her efforts in gathering facts from the research were pivotal in our quest for justice and recognition. Today, as we navigate through the complexities, one thing remains clear. Distinguishing fact from fiction is crucial in shaping policies that protect our community. Together, we are rewriting the narrative of microworkers in AI. Let's continue to push boundaries, challenge norms, and ensure that our voices resonate with where it matters most.
Wonderful. Okay, so the final output from this is we're holding a public exhibition of the different stories. So we have an illustrator that's mapping all the different stories that we've heard. And Joanne and her team are in the process of unionizing, so they're going to be submitting their registration for unions. That's going to take forever. We know that's not going to be easy, but that's where it is. So yeah, thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to use this mic so I can walk around. Excuse my papers. This morning my partner was like, whatever happened to cue cards? And I was like, I don't have time to cut out little pieces of cue cards, so I just have this piece of paper. Oh, this is the last slide. If you can just go to the first one. So yeah, let me just start by saying thank you very much for having me, I guess. It's such a privilege to be speaking to this wonderful audience and also to share the panel with Berhan. I was thinking this morning, it's called an Emerging Scholars panel, but when I read her bio, I kind of feel like she's already emerged. But I'm still very much on the emerging side of things, so yeah, many of you might know that I'm from Pretoria and I'm doing my PhD here. And as Edward mentioned as well, I also work for a project in Rwanda called the Global Education Movement, which helps higher education, refugees obtain their higher education degrees. It's sponsored by Southern New Hampshire University in America, in New Hampshire. And then we're divided between Kigali and South Africa. And our employer in South Africa is New Africa Center. So it's very complex to explain to people. If you want to hear more about that, please find me after, and I can maybe draw a picture and explain to you how everything connects. Oh my gosh, I don't have this thingy that I need. Okay, so this is the title of my PhD for now, and this is also the title of the presentation that I submitted, but as we started to talk, it's departed significantly from what I wanted to explain today. So yeah, I've already mentioned I'm from Pretoria, and my research focuses on decolonization in higher education, specifically in South Africa. So before I begin, I just want to explain, obviously, as a white woman, whenever we talk about decolonization, it brings my position of power and privilege into question. So, thank you for allowing me to take up space in this conversation. And I hope that, you'll allow me to act as a hopeful and sort of well-intentioned ally of this movement. I know there are some debates about this thing of like allies and do we even want them? So I really like this definition of allyship, which is defining it as the active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating, in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group. So what I like about this definition is that it's not really very glamorous. It's arduous because there shouldn't be any gain in being an ally. But what I like most about it is also that term where it talks about seeks to, because I do think that there's often going to be some failure when we try to act as allies, especially from a position of power. And this is something that I've started to see a lot when we talk about bringing technology to Africa and developmental contexts as well. So this is something that I discuss in my study, where in this article they talk about something called the openness paradox, which is where people who sort of, promote the benefits of technology and bringing it to developmental contexts often fail to acknowledge that specific context, or even the fact that it's just naturally going to be better leveraged in particular contexts than others. So that also happens when we look at this term, digital native, which I know a lot of people here will probably have come across it, and it has been debunked several times. So it was coined by Mark Prensky, and basically he said that the new generation, or the younger generation, grew up with technology, so we are supposed to be well versed in it and adept at using technology. Like, we know how to use it because we had so much exposure to it. And yeah, basically, obviously, once again, a complete disregard for differences in socioeconomic background and also language when we look at this term. So, like, what happens when we bring technology to higher education institutions in developing countries, and specifically in South Africa, which is the focus of my study? And the reason I focus on it is, well, I mean, partly because I am here, obviously, but also because South Africa, like the higher education landscape, has a very unique story to it. And, notably the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall and hashtag Fees Must Fall movements that occurred a few years ago. So Rhodes Must Fall started like in response to a student who was, the word in the media that was used was flinging feces onto the colonial statue of Cecil John Rhodes. And Fees Must Fall occurred in response to an increase in higher education fees. So the movement was characterized, the media sort of pictured it as being very violent, but underneath this movement was this need to decolonize the Eurocentric curriculum and also to demythologize whiteness, as Mbembe says. So that means to completely recall everything associated with whiteness and the historical entrapment of whiteness, which we could see through the physical removal of the statues, but also like the movement really centered on rooting the university in the common as well. And another part of this movement, which was very important, was this idea of democratizing access, also a term that Mbembe uses, which happens on two levels. So first of all, we want to democratize access, first of all, by obviously including marginalized people into universities. That's sort of the thing that, people do, and then they're like, oh, we're decolonizing. But also, when you include those people into the campus space, to ensure that they feel a sense of belonging there, that they feel a sense of being at home there. And that is really where a lot of these institutions, are failing their students. So as I was like contemplating, all of this, I also noticed a paradox similar to the openness paradox I mentioned earlier between like these calls for transformation on campuses and then the discourse and narratives of the 4IR. So the 4IR is definitely focused on like progress, industrialization, modernization, but there's also this thing of like speed, efficiency, and scale. And then the decolonial is like pretty much the inverse of all of that. So it got me to thinking, are these things compatible? Because both are present in the higher education space. I started to think that the increasing inclusion and emphasis on these types of technologies without them being scrutinized into higher education institutions in developing countries, like sort of threatened the decolonial project, but also the preservation of indigenous knowledges that we try to achieve. So even as I was writing my speech, Grammarly, well, I noticed now it's not Grammarly, it's actually another one of these like tools, was telling me that knowledges, plural, is not correct. Because according to Grammarly, there's only one type of knowledge, right? Knowledge with a capital W for white and Western, and a capital K for capitalism. Well, capitalism is not spelt with a K, but, I just wanted to run with that a little bit. So, as Maringa et al. Explains this tension, so the 4IR, sees the world as being organized around these tenets of modernization, and that resulted in this hegemony that like the West is the only acceptable way that we can develop. And then we have on the other side of that decolonization, which sees reality in terms of the subjugation of alternative knowledge system, which it seeks to bring back to the table of global ideas. So there's this tension between these two, and something that, really has stayed with me. It's something that can be found, like across campuses across the world, but I think especially those where we're trying to or have overt agendas to decolonize. I think it is really important. Also, now when we look at AI tools that are increasingly being included into these institutions through the AIED movement, it's especially important to look at how these tools can be incorporated and if they actually should be incorporated at all. So this is actually not the story of higher education, and everything that I've now explained is not the story that I want to tell today. And the story that I want to tell has really changed significantly since the first day that I stepped foot into this room. The story I want to tell is actually how I started to think about AI as I was starting my PhD, because this is me, a hopeful little PhD researcher. Now, a year and a half into it, like not as hopeful anymore. But the thing is, I was never a technical researcher at all. I am a qualitative research and really have always been interested in narratives and metaphors and how we can use them to explain complex ideas. And I really wanted to, continue my master's thesis, like the ideas that I built there, which was about public and private spaces on in higher education institutions in South Africa. So post fees must fall, a lot of universities responded with increased securitization measures like CCTV, like gates and fences and biometric access control. And it actually turned a lot of our campuses into gated communities. And that was what my master's thesis was about and what I wanted to stick with. But I started my proposal in December 2022, and there I was minding my own business, trying to do research on higher education, and AI was just everywhere. Like I couldn't escape this thing that was now entering into this space. So finally I gave in and I thought, okay, let me look at this. Because like when I was doing my master's study in the biometric access control measures, I was really interested in this thing of where students were being turned into quantified subjects, as Mbembe called call them. And, I was starting to think like this whole idea of like algorithms, is doing the same thing. But I didn't have any technical background, so, it was very strange for me to enter this space. My mind was very confused, and to this day still I exist in this state of like confusion and tension and chaos when I think of this technology. And I was also a little bit delusional, I think, when I started my study, when I thought about AI, because I wasn't looking at it critically. So I had very interesting ideas about like what it can and cannot actually do. So I want to share this story with you all today for two reasons. And the first one is just to share my story. Like, this is me, this is my story. And this is how I understand this tool and this technology. But the second reason is I really want to also explain and show how stories can contribute to alternative conceptualizations of AI beyond what we see just in the like technical domain. And like even the purely academic domain as well. So when this whole thing started, this was basically the sum of my knowledge, which was like, AI, okay, what is it? And definitely I sort of thought of Scarlett Johansson voice types and Alicia Vikander and robots like set to destroy all of humanity. But as I was writing this and I was contemplating like how it all started with this one word before I embarked on my study. So this reminded me of a sort of creation myth. So like the creation myths that also, they exist in all cultures to explain how the universe came into being, but this is the creation myth of how I came to understand AI in my own mind. But to understand, like, what I'm trying to say here, it would be helpful to just go back to a blank slate of what we think AI is, like completely wiping the mind, tabula rasa, and being open to this story. So creation myths about the birth of the universe also often start with this point of like there was infinite nothingness and chaos in the world, and then there was something. So that was pretty much my story as well. Today I want to focus or use a particular creation myth that I have a bit of a soft spot for this symbol. When I was doing my master's, many a time I used it to explain my ideas, to understand it, and to convey it to other people. And as I was writing this, I just felt myself pulled in that direction again today. So in Chinese mythology, the story goes as follows. The world started in this state of like disorganized chaos. It was contained in this sort of egg. And then this giant named Pangu emerged from this egg, and he split the world into yin and yang, and earth and sky. So I think many of us know this symbol, or you've maybe seen it like tattooed on someone's, wherever they, have it. So we know that like what it looks like, and that it signifies these two opposites, and that each also contains the other. So like this disorganized egg that birthed Pangu, my mind also tried to make sense of this technology in terms of opposites and dichotomies. So I first realized it when I came across this definition of AI, where it described it as a socio-technical artifact separated by this dash. And this intrigued me because I realized that, okay, this technology, exists in both of these spaces simultaneously, even though the technical side of it obviously receives far more attention and money and value than the other side. But for me, this was the first time that I actually felt like, oh, there's a social aspect to this technology. So it was very important for me to make that connection. So then I went and I started thinking of this way of like how AI is both an object and a subject. But like nature and nurture, and chicken and egg and all those types of debates, it's hard to put AI in either camp at a particular moment in time. So Muhammad et al. Has tried to do this with the explanation of as an object, we look at the computational power, algorithms, big data sets, and that is where AI exists as technical object. And as a subject, it's sort of more embedded and invisible in society and scrutinized by government and industry. So when looking at this, similar to the earlier tension, I saw it on this spectrum, but noticed that there was a sort of point of convergence in the middle. I then found this article where these authors explained, they basically explain how in actor network theory there was, human and non-human, and how there's this new pole that is occupied by AI. Now, I know it says there intelligent. Just ignore that for now, because we know that these machines are not intelligent. Of more interest to me was this idea that they described them as object subjects. So I saw this technology as straddling both of these spaces at once. And so this reminded me of that yin-yang effect, that AI exists in both states simultaneously, but that each also contains the other. So I want to return to this very earlier thought that I had, between the tension between 4IR and decolonization, because as I was starting to think about, okay, these object subjects, I also realized, but I want to bring them into a space that is also in and of itself experiences a very interesting tension. And that there's also a sort of point where the 4IR and the decolonial converge, which I was interested in exploring a little bit. But I'm going to flip this on its head so that I can go back to my metaphor. In the yin-yang metaphor, Pangu obviously emerged, and he divided the earth into yin and yang, but also earth and sky. And when I look at the 4IR and decolonization, I would like to put decolonization where the earth is and the 4IR where the sky is. Because when we look at decolonization, it's a return to our roots and a return to earth. And the sky, as representing the 4IR, I keep thinking of the space race and how people are always chasing what's up there in the heavens and progress. So that's why I said that the 4IR is represented by the heavens or the sky. So this point of convergence that I was interested in has been described by these authors as an Afro-global episteme. So for them, this episteme is a model which prioritizes self-discovery and local knowledge as the basis for engaging global knowledge systems. And this has also been echoed by other authors who have stated that we have to look at this tension or any resolution to this tension as a conversation between the global and the local, and that we can use the local to move the global forward and also use the global to move the local forward. I mean, in an ideal world, I don't think we are doing that right now, but, So, to summarize all of my thoughts, and the story and everything, we know, or I, by this point knew that AI is not just the subject or object, but it straddles both these spaces simultaneously. And that it's also in this space where, we have the decolonial and the 4IR, which also has interesting interactions and also exists on this spectrum. But all of these things are always talking to one another, and they're always in conversation with one another. And by using this metaphor, I've hoped to illustrate this as well. In the yin-yang mythology, the earth and the sky are always exchanging energy with one another, and they give rise to humans and life forces. And I think in the same way, the decolonial and 4IR are also exchanging energy with one another and giving rise to new technologies and new contexts, and hopefully also new ways of understanding them. So when PhD students attend conferences, they often start with this, but I'm going to end with this, with my research question today, because this was the story of how I arrived at this question. You'll notice that I talk about the new digital divide here, so that's basically just because the previous term, the digital divide, which represents the divide between the haves and the have-nots, has been found that it's not suitable really to capture all of these tensions and nuances in the context in which we want to include these technologies, if we even want to include them, right? Because after Edward's talk, I didn't add this, if at all. Like, it was always there in my research question, but it's like I'm only seeing it now for the first time, like really looking at it. Like, do we even want these technologies in our institutions? Like any type of creation myth, there's always this possibility of an apocalypse or end of the world situation. And like with this technology, there might be a need or a reason for destruction. And I think one that should be seriously considered when we look at the speed at which these technologies are being included into institutions. So when I look at like destruction, I immediately go to fire and burning stuff and whatever the case may be. But maybe we can just start with like a quiet destruction and just re-look at what we mean when we speak about this term, when we speak about AI. Nietzsche famously proclaimed, "God is dead and we have killed him." And that phrase has often been like, taken out of context. What Nietzsche meant by that phrase was that it was the death of transcendental signifiers, and people were left to create their own lives on their own terms without seeking validation or guidance from these external signifiers. So I hope that we can one day arrive at a similar point with AI. I'm of the belief that we can only arrive there through the listening and retelling and capturing of our stories, as I have tried to do today, which, it is a story of me, but it's also a story of all of us and what we've been talking about at this conference, of how alternative understandings of AI can inform socio-technical spaces, how stories and myths can inject value and meaning into the effects of technology in particular contexts, especially developmental contexts, and how stories can bridge the gap between how we talk about, conceive, or create narratives of AI, or of how we can destroy them. Thank you.
This is working? All right, thank you both for the presentations. I'll take questions from you guys first before we go virtual, but I do want to ask one question of both of you before. The first question I have, I have two, one for you. And the first is, usually in discussions of artificial intelligence and value and inputs that go into it or come out of it, there's a lot of discussion of capital expenditures for GPUs, of environmental costs of electricity, of the ability to disrupt creative labor or displace current labor, create labor productivity gains, and this is why we should invest in it. But there's not the discussions that happen around these workers who are doing the cleansing and the labeling and the transforming usually happen in very specific ways and are limited. And I would love to hear your thoughts on the success that companies have had in insisting that the real infrastructure is the capital that we're spending on GPUs and data centers instead of the labor that we have to get at, because there's such a massive turnover rate that's being used for labeling, that's being used for cleansing, that's being used for transforming, that's being used for all the fundamental tasks that allow them to then go to investors with and demand over inflated valuations. And then the second one, I'm interested in, with artificial intelligence and its and ways of integrating into education systems. I mean, some of the techno-optimists have, their theories of education are very shallow and far removed from, I think, what you were talking about and getting at in looking at some of the literature. But, there you can see a glimmer, I think, of something that might be desirable, if not for the fact that they were nightmare capitalists, in that there's a concern or an interest in how do you introduce another actor or another agent into education that gets out of the way it's today deployed to socialize or train workers, or to fit people into very specific pipelines into specific industries, or in one way or another there's a gap between value and satisfaction, or what you're putting into education, what you're getting out of it, and so some of these capitalists desire agents or AIs on their shoulders to try to provide or augment education. And I wonder if you think that there is some system or some orientation of these automated systems, or maybe you don't hand over the whole system to them, but they play some role in improving education. Or do you think that that's antithetical to the project entirely, if there's no place for it at all? I mean, I personally don't, but I'm also interested in thinking about what room, if any, there is for these things, or what arguments people might deploy, and then pushing back against that.
Yeah, so I do agree with you that by virtue of how these things exist, that they do seem like they are antithetical. And one thing that has been plaguing me for the entirety of this conference, and I still don't have the answer to this, is when people talk about design justice principles and then AI at scale, and we keep asking how do you marry those two things? Because you have design justice here and you have AI at scale over here, and then is there a marriage between the two? And I think the decolonial project and then the incorporation of these technologies have the same issue. I do think there's something there in terms of what I mentioned about if we engage the global and the local and use the local as a point of departure. So that would mean not trying to fit the local to the global, but doing it the other way around. So literally ignoring global, building from local, and then going from there. That's obviously not where we are, but that could be something, there could be something there. Because at the moment we're trying to say how do we fit design justice principles to global AI at scale, instead of saying how do we just build on the local, build on design justice principles. So I do think there's something there, but I do not think with the technologies as they exist at the moment and the discourse with 4IR and also the control of big tech and stuff, as it exists now, I don't think there's a marriage there yet.
Yeah, go on. So the biggest thing that I see, and we've been talking about this, is that a lot of these companies are trying to sell a myth, right? AI can do this, AI can do that, and this goes back to how Amazon Mechanical Turk was named, right? So, and I know I'll butcher the story, but a few centuries ago, this guy built a massive horse. He put a human inside the horse, and then he was selling it as if the horse can play chess. And people were just could not believe it. But nobody told them that actually there was a human being that was moving that horse from within. And technically, actually, literally, Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is one of Jeff Bezos, human as a service, providing labor to these platforms, was actually literally named, right? So there is a deliberate attempt to hide the amount of extensive work that goes into these platforms. And because if you have to, if your marketing pitch is, yeah, we have to hire, 10,000 workers in Kenya for you to be able to automate the system, that doesn't sound sexy. I don't think people are gonna be, I don't think the capitalists, your PE investors and the Volter capitalists are gonna come and say, yay, let's do that, right? That doesn't, so there's a lot of myth that happens, but also, the question around what are these tools selling? So we've had a lot of conversation about sort of the snake oil that is being sold with these platforms. So it goes hand in hand, and if you're also trying to pay your labor force decent living wage and salary, you will not be making all that profit. So Alexander Wang would not be a billionaire, right? If we were sharing the fruits and the dividends of these tools. So it's pure, really at its purest form. This is what capitalism is. It's trying, and this is not, again, this is not the only sector this happens to. The fact that we can go to H&M and buy a $5 shirt is because somebody has done the work for literally pennies, right? So yeah, so it's an extension of the system, but I'm hoping it's, it's downhill for them for these modern day, I don't want to say slave lords, but they're very close there. Yeah.
So, okay. So one thing I have is kind of observation or a thought, like as you guys were speaking, and then Trudee, one thing I was thinking about in education, but then very specific in design education, I think one of the successes, also misfires, or one of the things, the success that we have consequences in right now is that in design education, when you're talking about, say, products or communication arts or things like that, one of the successes within the education is to create things and make labor and industry inconsequential. So when we talk about like streamlining packages such as like an Apple product, right? Well, we think about streamlining an Apple product as the object, but we also streamline the production methods to get there, and all of that is a neat package that designers are trained to make. So I was just thinking about that in terms of like training for like design and the products that we have. And then my question is, Berhan, the myth that you were just speaking about, but I also think like in the way these technologies are presented, do we think that baked into these technologies to give them credence, power, mythology is also, as they're introduced, you're kind of calculating that they also have to get chased, right? So there's this idea of like it's in control on one end. One community, one country, one industry has it under control, and then everybody else has to chase it down, and then that keeps it in people's imaginations and even gives it more power. And just thinking about like what are the ways, and I think Harry also spoke to this really important, is like what are the ways to resist like thinking about, all right, this is a wave, how do we skip waves in order to really understand that and resist this idea of chasing, especially I would say as it is imposed on, I would say, developing countries or even marginalized groups.
Yeah, I think that's like, there's a lot there. I think for me, this was something that also came to my mind with the first question is, I read a post on LinkedIn yesterday where someone was saying how OpenAI, sort of dodges all these things surrounding copyright and stuff with this narrative of like, oh my gosh, we are building this important technology. Like, we don't have time to worry about copyright right now. So I think, and also this AGI is often used to promote this technology, and part of that mystery is what sells it. So for me, I think the first step towards that is definitely just bringing in the facts, as you mentioned, this isn't magic, these are workers, this is how it works, and that is the only way we do that is by being transparent. And when we have transparency, we realize how this works, and when we realize that it's not magic, we can remove some of that myth. And then, I think that's maybe the first step in the right direction.
Thank you for that question. So all of you know this guy called Tony Blair, right? The war criminal that's not in prison just yet. But he has an institution. It's called the Tony Blair Institute, I think. So basically what he does is he goes around to all majority African and Eastern European countries, and he pitches ideas. Ideas about how you can, deliver a government, how you can organize your government, and some of it is useful, and then they'll hire you, consultants to be able to do that. And for some weird reason, I get LinkedIn job ads from this guy, from this company. It's funny. So the other day I was looking for somebody else called Tony, and then I could see the list in my email, and the list of the job ads came up. So progressively now they're pitching AI as a tool. So they're trying to hire more AI advisors, technology developers, and you can see before it was climate. Before then was, I think, maternity. So there are, I think for me, what I call the alliance of the wicked, where there are groups, with government institutions, IMF, these think tanks, and the private sector, really the tech private sector that is in an alliance to expand into a lot of developing countries. And to our own detriment, a lot of our policymakers are not really informed about these tools. If you ask a Kenyan, ICT minister today, who's very proud of having a lot of these boot camps in the country, how is data processed? How are these companies set up? He would not be able to tell you. Actually, there are government-funded programs in the country by MasterCard Foundation and others that are training young people to go into this work without providing the protections that are needed, right? So there is, and they really have, they've drunk the Kool-Aid. Previously, now you get, I don't know how many of you get these ads, but AI for development is a thing. It's the only thing that we can talk about, right? I think you are right, we have to resist, and the resistance comes with facts, right? So understanding, do I want, is it ethical to say that we should diagnose malaria using a generative tool? Don't people deserve to have doctors? And I was telling Harry, I was telling him, don't talk about this. Don't talk about this in front of health ministers. They're not going to fund our healthcare. That's what's going to happen, right? Everybody's looking for that shortcut. So it's about resisting. I think it's about willing to miss the wave. But also being really critical and saying that, we need to, some of these tools are really useful, and we need to build those infrastructures. We've seen with COVID-19, for instance, we didn't have any vaccine. We didn't have the vaccine industry, and we were skipped so many times because that technology, it's not to say that we don't need this technology, there are some useful ones. So having that really balanced approach and saying, what is useful for us, what is not useful for us, and being okay with saying, we're missing this wave, let China and America fight this out, and whichever side wins, we'll pick the technology that works, right? So I'll end there anyways,
Thank you both very much for those presentations, super interesting. My question is for Berhan. I guess it was really fascinating to kind of look at specifically the work that these people are doing as well. And I guess what struck me is that, this isn't work that I could just pick up and do myself, right? It does require some kind of expertise, yeah? There's dexterity in terms of how to use these tools. It has to be done very quickly. There's knowledge about how machines kind of down the line are going to be interpreting these results. And so there is technical knowledge that kind of comes into play here as well. I guess, this got me reflecting on the history of engineering as a discipline as well, right? And to think that, professions in themselves aren't self-evident, but rather, they're defined by these boundaries of how we kind of constitute knowledge and who has claims over that knowledge. And so I guess that, makes me wonder also, like, how can these boundaries kind of be defined otherwise, right? How can this work be kind of thought of, or, towards professionalization perhaps? And we have histories about, constructing codes of conduct and norms within professions to kind of allow for, autonomy over a discipline and I guess a school of thought as well. So yeah, I guess I'd love your reflections on, how can we move towards professionalization perhaps and maybe more control?
Oh yeah, so I'll just have a bit of a provocative question. So, sometimes in developing countries, the government could not provide enough jobs. And when these, I'm just thinking of Sayak's talk yesterday, but also, the context in the Philippines and, the BPO industry, which actually is, to some extent somehow pays a little bit more than the minimum wage. So how do you find actually a balance when the government could not provide jobs? Particular AI industries might provide an income which might be way less than the minimum wage in the countries where these AI companies are based, but actually kind of like perhaps the minimum wage or even a bit more in developing countries. And people need to eat, people need to have homes. So how do we find a balance between, and are there particular bright spots or particular companies that have potentially fairer or more ethical practices? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we can take those two. Yes, so Will, to your question, these platforms sell this work as low-skilled, but it takes the amount of collective intelligence that the group has, one, in terms of even navigating a system that doesn't work, right? Knowing that if you put 16, polygon annotations onto, a kiwi, they know it doesn't work because it's out of, experience. So it's sold as if it's a low, wage work, low skilled. You don't need any sort of any practice, which is a myth. So there is attempts, there's attempts to professionalize. Unfortunately, the biggest issue that we have currently is that the platforms or the companies that have this capacity, whether it's the LiDAR processing, polygon annotation, all of them are based either in the US or in Europe. Actually, significant are based in the US. So if we had companies that had this, that were doing this work, so that people can, it actually the people that do this work, from going from a tasker to a reviewer to a super reviewer, a trainer, it's not easy. It's like it's years of experience that is required. So there could be ways that this can be professionalized. Daniel was telling us how he was trying to professionalize content moderation as a skill, and I've seen, for instance, for Joanne and others, they were looking into, okay, how can we professionalize this? So a bunch of the companies that provide this kind of training for you to be able to sort of run, collect the data and get it to be machine ready, it's $4,000, $5,000 to be trained. Right, like so all of those that are providing that professional certification that is needed to run this kind of programs are extremely expensive. So there is, there are some attempts to sort of, how do we bring down, one, the cost, but also, how can we collectively train this guy so that you're not just training them. What MasterCard and other currently are doing is that they're just training you, you can log into the system, this is what polygon annotation is, this is what segmentation is, and they don't move beyond that. And that's sort of the space that we need to professionalize. So yeah, so I agree with you, this can be, a lot of technical schools can also do this. This can be vocational training. There's a couple, and we're very good at that. So there is that space where we just haven't found, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. And then John, to your question, yes, people do need to eat, 100%, I agree with you. But also the fact that, we need to eat doesn't mean that we have to be abused. These BPOs, so I can give you an example of the difference between a company like Samasource, where Daniel was talking to us about, will provide a contract, will provide just above the minimum wage. Literally just a bit, like maybe 100 shillings or 200 or 1,000 or 2,000. But the exploitation is still the same. The fact that Facebook has outsourced content moderation work to Kenya is not, it's not an accident, it's by design. It's because they're not interested in sharing the wealth that comes out of this ecosystem. So of course we want BPOs to come. We want a lot of these companies to set up so that people can have decent jobs where the government is unable to provide decent jobs. But that also doesn't mean that it has to come with exploitation. The government has a responsibility to protect workers, but the businesses also have a responsibility, right? So for us, it's about balancing, just because we need food and we're poor doesn't mean that we have to be exploited. The amount of, mental health, like some people, you log in, you're being told to annotate pornography websites. Like there's no warning. There's maybe Toloka and others have a trigger warning, or you're being asked to annotate like dead bodies in a morgue, right? Like, so there is a lot of, it's not just about the money as well. It's also about, it has to be, the work has to be decent, and you have to provide a lot of supports. Otherwise, you end up with, a young population that's dissatisfied, that is dealing with a lot of PTSD. So it's finding that right balance, and one doesn't have to come before the other. I think we can have good policies, and we can bring these jobs, we can do really good, and we can train our workforce. So, yeah.
All right, I'll go. I just want to say my comments are based on Trudee's presentation, and they're pretty broad, and they may not be specifically targeted towards you. Given that you're descendants of European settlers in South Africa, which has already provided you with immense privilege, and that you are least likely to experience disparate impacts of AI, despite being based in Africa, can you define what it means to push for Afrocentric decolonial AI? And also, I want to note that I've seen a lot of research on decolonial AI in African contexts led by white African quote-unquote scholars, which often fails to acknowledge their respective privilege and is honestly against the goals of decoloniality, which is to delink from Eurocentric knowledge hierarchies. And again, this question is pretty broad, and I don't want to seem like I'm attacking you, but just also want to unpack what decolonial AI means to you in this context.
Okay, yeah, there's once again a lot to unpack there. There's one article that I want to refer to, but I can't remember the name of it now, but there is a belief by some scholars that it is actually impossible to decolonize AI just by virtue of the nature of the technology itself. And as mentioned before, something that I have been sort of thinking about a lot in this conference is this idea of how we situate the local within this discourse of AI. But now I find myself like sort of going towards like, do we even want to do that? And I'm wondering where the relationship is between like decolonizing AI, like if we even should we even be bothered with that, or should we just, like destroy it entirely? I know that sounds like bad, but it's just, for me, I do think that there's so much there that it's hard to verbalize my thoughts. But I think, like as I mentioned earlier, I think there is a potential there to make strides in the correct direction, but it needs to be led by the right people, and it needs to be led, it also needs to have the correct intention. And for this, like this technology as it exists at the moment, and I think this is something that also comes up time and time again when we discuss the design justice principles, is like, we are not the people profiting from this. Our continent is not profiting from it, like our people are not profiting from it. Big tech is profiting from it. So, I think, calls to decolonize AI, they should be treated, especially like people like me who come from a position of power and privilege, should definitely be asked these questions and be interrogated for their place in the discussion. Absolutely. But just in terms of like decolonizing it, I don't know if like putting it in someone else's hands is the right move. I think maybe like even just removing it from the discussion entirely, like building a decolonial agenda on something different than AI, because at the end of the day, I just find myself bumping up against the incompatibility of it all time and time again as the technology exists at this point in time. Because I'm not saying it's hopeless, but definitely, you know, as I look at it now and where it's going, it is very hard to marry it with the decolonial agenda.
So I'd like to follow up on that because I love the idea that people should have a right of refusal of this technology, of participating in it, of as a user and certainly as someone contributing data. But I'm struggling to understand how that works. How do you block such technologies given a context of global access through VPNs and so on? And does an attempt to refuse it cost a place at the table that might do something toward making it more just? I have no idea what the answers are to this, but I'm wondering how it works. Like, how is it at the level of like a country's government that policies can be made? How does this work?
That reminds me of your comment the other day about circumvention, which I found very interesting. Was it Uber drivers that you mentioned? Yeah, so, you know, this destroy AI narrative thing is very new to me. I'm not at all an expert. I think Edward is the expert on sabotage and also Berhan. But in terms of it costing a seat at the table, I'm finding myself asking whose table? And is that a table I want to sit at the end of the day? In terms of what it will look like in practice, I think, you know, there are examples of like small circumventions that can, you know, like the resistance that you mentioned as well. There will always be a way to circumvent these technologies and the effects. So I definitely think that's one way to take a step in that direction. Yeah, does that answer your question? Maybe there isn't an answer. Yeah.
I'm trying to wrap my head around like distinct examples of how one would go about sort of using these technologies.
Would you mind sharing the example that you did the other day about the circumvention?
Yeah,
I think it's a good example.
So the way I think about this is from a value-based principles, right? Like, so we should 100% say no to Uber's automated algorithmic, you know, wage system. We should outright say no, because the sources of data that they use to make that decision is not clear to anyone. But also what we've seen is that since they've introduced that across the world, drivers' wages have gone down by 30%, right? Like for me, that's really easy just to say, fuck no, we don't want that, right? There are, you know, systems, for instance, I can give you, you know, a personal example. So my mom has had breast cancer, my sister has had breast cancer, and then I don't think they'd be happy for that to be live streamed, but so we have a history of breast cancer in our family. So we're all of my sisters will do, you know, yearly checkups, and some of us 6 months. So what happened when I went and did that checkup a few years ago was my doctor was using an automated risk assessment form. That was, you know, we would put in all the data of like who within the family history has had all of that, and then it will give you a score. So that score is if you're above a certain level, then you're supposed to do an MRI and ultrasound alternating every 6 months so that you can catch whatever. And we've done the DNA test and everything else. So that was I was like, okay, that's really great. When we went through that, my score was higher than what she had wanted, but not as crazy as she had expected. But we were like, still, you know, my insurance will cover it, let's go ahead and do that. But then I was very curious in terms of, you know, what is this tool that you're using that can, and so I also wanted to send it to my siblings so that they can do it where they are. So she sent it to me. As I was filling that form again, I was asked to choose race. And for a black woman sitting out of Kenya, why am I being asked to choose race? So if I had chosen white, my risk would have gone up by 50%, which would have been a completely different regime and things that I needed to do. So again, it's from a value point of view, right? Like, so a lot of these tools that are being exported, and my doctor even didn't know that this was a factor. This was a tool that was being exported from the US in a context where 90.999% of the population is really, black, right? So again, from a value point of view, these tools should not be accepted. So for me, it's not, I don't want to, and we've seen our colleague talking about how they've used, NLPs and others to sort of map frequencies of language, which I think is really wonderful. So the question wouldn't be like, let's destroy all of it, but what is this tool that we're using? How is it informed, and how can we, from that conversation, then we can go forward. And really avoiding using the term, AI, because AI really doesn't mean anything. So that's sort of the approach that I think we should have. And when we do that, I think we are in a place of power to know that what are the decisions that are being made on behalf of us, right? So if my insurance probably would not have covered it, she would have told me to, and I went to a different country and they're like, we don't use these tools. So like, from your history, from a conversation with you and from what I've seen, you need to do these things every 6 months because it's critical, right? Like, so so contextualizing it in that way, and from a value point of view, do we want a tool that, that makes decisions in an opaque, and then you have to accept that decision? Probably no.
Thank you so much for very enlightening conversations. And I say conversations because it rubs off against most of the things that we have talked about, yes, but also brings lived experiences to the fore. I was thinking so much when Berhan was presenting of my own experience, or that of my brother, who is like, he just graduated, and then he's a freelancer, he writes stuff, and he's trying to look for something else. Then I went on Twitter one day and I found this, someone advertising data annotation, remote task, outlier, and invisible. So these 4 platforms, as platforms that Africans, it was this very smug way of promoting them. I was like, if you want to make money, well, I'm not going to say this 2 times. If you want to make money, then check this out. I've been making my own money, and then all of that. And I was like, oh my God. So I went on data annotation, and then there was this test thing, and that was what started exposing that much of what is on ChatGPT. They will ask you, between these 2 responses, say which response is more intelligent or which response is better and why. Then you have to write an entire essay. So it's literally me doing the work that I thought AI was doing. Like everything, they asked me, even down to a friend of yours asked for this book, read this book, and he has been recommended this other book. This other recommendation, is it better based on the first book that he has read? I'm like, dude, that's something that I would have asked AI. And so everything was, it was mind-blowing for me. And it said it helped me to come to the realization that, especially based on my experience with Fiverr, Upwork, and other freelancing sites like that, it helped me come to the realization that these sort of task, human labor thing, is just freelancing at its finest. And if we are familiar with freelancing on some level, you realize that freelancing needs to be overhauled in the way it works. So I was wondering, what is the work done beyond just trying to professionalize, beyond trying to like give these workers a decent sense of livelihood and all that? What is the work that is being done to totally remove that illusion that the AI is AI, like you already said, or removing the illusion that the work done behind AI is done by AI? And what is the work that is being done to frame this work as freelancing? Because that is what it is. So what are your thoughts on this? And just not to jump too much, I want to relate it to what Trudee said on the creation myth. I also see the world through the point of view of stories. And I was thinking, rather than mythologize AI, I think it is better to turn the myth into a legend. That is the transformative power of stories, whereby what is mythologized then becomes a legend. Like the telling the legend of the mechanical Turk, as it is transformative in many ways. Just having that story told in different ways changes people's perspective. And I was also thinking that even in the work of removing that illusion, making a legend rather than mythologizing this process, making a legend out of the stories of people and their experiences can help. But please, what further thoughts do you have? Thank you, Berhan.
So thank you both for your presentations. I have a question for Berhan, like a comment and a question. Yeah, of course I loved your presentation, but the subject matter, so infuriating, such an injustice, makes me really angry to hear about the conditions. One of the things that struck me when you talked about like the way that the workers have resisted and like alternatives is that in your like resistance list, it's like it's a sad reality that there's such small acts of like, having different accounts. It's really great to see that they're resisting, but it's sad that that's what they have to do. But then when you look at like the alternatives, it's what was noted was, again, resistance from the data workers, like cooperatives, worker-owned data shops. And I wonder what the role of like the broader critical AI community, civil society can do to, I don't know, like boycott or having media campaigns or naming and shaming or organising or storytelling or other things like that we can do to support the resistance and in a way that is sensitive to the politics of making sure that it's not like we're amplifying their voices and their needs and wants. So I guess what more can we do to help?
So for me, to your point, removing the illusion is really critical. And I feel like the media plays such a significant role in just selling this hype over and over again. Honestly, if OpenAI hadn't done what it had done, maybe the media would not have been as conscious. Right now, they're, New York Times and everybody else's tools are being used. Authors are up in arms with them, which is good. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but the illusion that is sold is so strong, and there's a lot of money that goes into selling that illusion, because there's a lot of money that can be made for basically for Western Europe and North America to feel like, oh, I'm buying this book, someone is like just the ease of life, right? Like many of these things, if they were if they were helping make life-enabling decisions, right? Like if it was, if a lot of this was for, medicine and we were leapfrogging and we were curing cancer and all of those things, that you're like, okay, maybe the tiny thing that I've put here could be the grand big scheme of things. But it really is for Europeans to take a picture of food and for them to be able to be told if it's, the reality is that, right? And, so if you look at sort of how the workforce is distributed versus the market that it's trying to serve is, unless the drones are coming back to bomb us, I know this is maybe a very difficult conversation to have this early in the morning, there's not much that these tools are they're not being designed for us, they're not much that we can use in many of its form, right? Like, so for me, there's an illusion that needs to be kept, and the media is a significant player into this. But also, the conversation that Nikki was having yesterday, I think is really critical here in terms of, after the panel we were having conversation, I was, if you have a post-capitalist, ideology, I feel like we need to indoctrinate people from the young so that they can understand that this myth has so much consequence, right? Like, a lot of people taught slavery, indentured servitude, was okay. A lot of people don't understand, like, capitalism is racial in many contexts. And it's important for them not to understand so that we all can live this, this myth that has been there. So the media plays a significant role. I think universities, libraries, storytelling, there are a lot of books, the work that, you and I have been talking about in terms of showing people how you can use AI and what it is and how it's built without making the invisible force that does this work invisible is really critical so that we can say, we can understand what it is. And Noel, to your point, we can resist, right? Like, so I'm an optimist when it comes to these things. So there's a lot of resistance that's happening. But I think one thing that's really critical that in a space like this that we need to understand is we have to ask the question the same way that we ask the question, where is this food made from? Does it have sulfate? Apparently that's a thing. We should be asking, where is this tool made from? Who are the labor force that is being required to do this? If your universities are running this significant machine learning, NLP, and other programs, you should be asking, how was this data made? How was it cleaned? Who did the work? If it was not done on campus or within your borders, it probably was sent off to somewhere else. So that conversation is really critical. And we've seen, and again, this is not the first sector that has had this, in industry, like factory workers and like across the world have gone through this, car manufacturers, right? So there's also a lot that we can learn from other labor unions and other movements that have done this. So for me, it's the critical that, unfortunately, you need the West to boycott these things. If I say I boycott OpenAI, great. I don't use it anyways. You get what I mean? Like, so it's those that are, folks that are using apps like UCA, for instance, should be the one that should be asking. So there needs to be a lot of advocacy and policy work that needs to be done in order for us, to be able to do that. But the resistance is also political. By us saying that, I don't want an automated decision-making system to make that decision for me. I don't want you to use your facial recognition technology when I'm boarding a flight, when you can just see my passport and can confirm that I am who I am, right? So these are like the small things. I feel like we need a wave of resistance against a lot of these tools but again, it can't stop at don't use my face for your system. It has to also really boil down to the workers that do this work. Because without them, these tools are empty vessels, literally empty. There's nothing in them. Yeah, so it's that really, bringing them back to that conversation is really critical. And I shouldn't be, excuse me, I'm not a worker, right? I shouldn't be the one speaking for it. There are many wonderful people that are organizing this, like Daniel and others, that should be at the forefront of these conversations, yeah.
Questions from the chat that I'll read out. The first question is to Trudee. If possible, could you give us an example of how you are using AI to promote higher education in refugee context? Also, given your reference to yin yang, how does the decolonial approach help you reconcile the benefits of this technology for higher ed and its use for quantifying the same refugees you are trying to help? Yeah, I'll repeat any part you want.
Okay, just the first half, because then I'm not.
If possible, could you give us an example of how you're using AI for promoting higher education?
I'll first answer that one. Okay, so yeah, there might be a bit of confusion. My research and my day job are not linked, if I can put it that way. So I do research on AI in higher education institutions in South Africa, and then my day job helping refugees. Yeah, so they're not linked. So I'm not using AI tools in the refugee space, not at all. I do in my own small way at work talk about so I can give some context as to how AI has played into our students' lives when ChatGPT came onto the scene. We started picking up students using it, and our students, especially a lot of them. A lot of them are not native English speakers, so it was evident, their use of the technology was very evident, they were not good at hiding their use of the technology. We started using Turnitin's AI recognition feature as soon as it was released, and so anything above 80% initially was flagged for plagiarism, and then it just didn't work, it wasn't accurate, so we stopped it completely. And now we're at a point where, like, only if it's blatantly evident that the student used the tool will we flag them, but you like really have to prove that the student used this tool, because we don't use any of the AI detectors because they're just not trustworthy. So it has made its way into the space, but we don't use AI as like the educators. We don't really use it, and our students don't use it as much as I think other students do, like students in other contexts. And then what was the second half of the question? I'm sorry.
Given your reference to yin yang, how does the decolonial approach help you reconcile the benefits of this technology for higher ed and its use for quantifying the same refugees you're trying to help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so okay, that goes back to this thing that I keep bringing up, which is, can we reconcile the decolonial with the 4IR, with these technologies? So I mentioned that, like with my master's, there was this idea of the quantified subject that Mbembe says, but Mbembe actually referred to people as quantified subjects in institutions prior to biometric access control and surveillance, like just by virtue of the capitalist nature of universities, and students are like the products. So this was even prior biometrics, prior algorithmics and stuff. These things just enhance these processes, because obviously we know that like this quantification of humans is like a colonial thing. So I don't reconcile these benefits like in that question. Like I don't think necessarily the benefits of the technology can be reconciled with decolonization as yet, as these tools exist. As mentioned earlier, we can make strides towards talking about that, looking at it in different ways, but we are not yet at a place where there's reconciliation.
And then another question is to Berhan, and it's about resistance. One part is, what about the affordances of these apps creates opportunities for different kinds of resistance? Things like multiple logins, for example. Do you see any other possibilities for taking the existing structures, like the app's login feature, for fighting back in these subtle ways? What about the affordances of these apps creates opportunities for different kinds of resistance? Things like multiple logins, for example. Do you see any other possibilities for taking the existing structures, like the app's login feature, for fighting back in these subtle ways?
Yes and no. What we've seen is that a lot of these platforms really surveil their workers. So if you take a screenshot of what you're working on, you're sharing it with your friend because you have the struggle with maybe passing one of the tasks, you would automatically get blocked. So there's a lot of surveillance that happens around how long have you been on the platform, how many minutes, how long does it take you? So it really depends. One thing that the platform had failed to do, which I think now it has integrated in other jurisdictions, is that now they're looking at IMEI numbers of laptops, right? Like, so if you can't log in with multiple from the same device, for instance. So there's a lot of sort of cat and mouse chasing that people have to do continuously. Some of the ways that the system will have a glitch. So, for instance, let's say you finish a task, you submit it, you're done with the task and you're trying to submit, and it doesn't let you. But also in other contexts, before you're done, you can submit, for instance. So people are using when they see those activities, they'll jot down the task ID number and then they'll send it to their friend. And so everybody will be doing the same task. They can quickly submit, get their money. So it really depends, but there's a lot of surveillance that happens on the platform. And a lot of accounts actually get suspended without any justification. So from a research point of view, from me, it was very difficult to play around with that, because if someone's account gets suspended, then that's sort of their livelihood. So the resistances that we documented were, asking people, okay, you've talked about all of these problems. How are you fighting this? You know, what are the loopholes that you found? So these are the things that they've sort of said. So there could be some if somebody would be exploring the platform a bit differently.
This has been such an amazing panel, and we want to let you go to lunch on time because, just a reminder, we have the alt talks happening at 2 o'clock, and then right after that, we have the Design Justice Labs meeting, which is going to piggyback with doing further collaborative work on our own design justice principles oriented around AI. And we'll talk more about that at 3 o'clock. But I just wanted to say that this panel has been really amazing. I mean, you know, Berhan's work is so eye-opening, and, you know, it makes me wonder if Trudee had begun her AI journey, let's call it, recognizing the things that Berhan knows and has documented are the actual material foundation of what is being called AI, she probably would have had a very different journey. But I also love the way both speakers, you know, I think Trudee called it quiet destruction, which I kind of loved. And Berhan has been talking about how little things accumulate. And I think that's very, very true. Every single one of you, whether you know it or not, and I hope you all know it, is participating in quiet destruction. Many of you also educate students and the public, those who make policy. So even though there is a huge amount of power and a huge amount of money being channeled into the idea that there is this AI juggernaut that none of us can possibly do anything but yield to and accept, there's also a lot of hubris and a lot of ignorance. These people are victims of their own incapacity to listen and make sense of the world. They live in bubbles that make sense to absolutely no one. So there's a lot of great work that can be done. And I just want to say that I'm hearing from so many people who are following us online as we work or have just begun to hear about us, you know, how inspired they are by the work being done in this room. I think that, you know, by working together about how to get these messages across in a way that makes sense to people, students, workers, people living in the gray, as Brittany Cooper put it, developers, you know, just the world, that we can make an impact. And I just want you to feel empowered and just, and also grateful for the wonderful papers that we just heard as we go into lunch and do more hard work later on today. So I should thank Edward for his great response and work moderating. He gets the last word.
I don't really have a last word, to be honest, or one that can follow yours up. I think, I think both the labor that sits at the root of, you know, these automated and machine learning systems, as well as visions and dreams of integrating them into education and reproduction, social reproduction, are really, really, really important and pressing, and also some of the places where you get to see some of the most ambitious moves, I would say, by capitalists to try to either close off potential futures or convince us that there's no other alternative. Well, we'll ignore that. But yeah, I stole that one from Vice before they went bankrupt, which is but I also think it's a site of some of the most interesting and exciting work, as we saw here today, to think about, you know, ways in which we can look and think and experiment with new systems and alternatives, or, you know, places where we don't need them, you know, and thinking about the question of, you know, maybe we don't want to accept the cost of these systems in the education system and in labor and the weird conditions it imposes, you know, for example, in Kenya, where you have this sort of transitory alien coming in and trying to and pulling in as many laborers as possible and uprooting communities and lives in a bid to do pretty grueling and diminutive and undignified work. So I think I come away with this feeling a bit. I feel anytime I talk about anything with AI, I come away feeling a little bit more aware of like despair, but also thinking more optimistically or more hopefully about alternatives. So thank you both for the presentations and a lot to think on.
Thank you.